The sound of metal hitting metal echoed through the quiet afternoon as I closed my gate with a satisfying click. On the other side, Karen Martinez stood frozen for exactly 3 seconds before exploding into the biggest adult tantrum I've ever witnessed. "Open this gate right now," she screamed, grabbing the metal bars and shaking them like a caged animal. "I am the HOA president. You can't do this to me." I just stood there watching her lose her mind, trying not to smile. In my pocket was a piece of paper that would change everything once I pulled it out. But not yet. Right now I was enjoying the show way too much. See, Karen had no idea that the quiet tenant who paid rent on time every month was standing right in front of her. She had no clue that the problem neighbor she was trying to intimidate was actually her landlord. And she definitely didn't know that her little power trip was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. Let me back up and tell you how this whole mess started. 3 months ago, I inherited my uncle's house in Sunset Gardens, a nice little suburb about 30 minutes outside Phoenix. Uncle Ray had been a smart man. He'd bought rental properties all over the neighborhood back when they were cheap. When he passed away, he left me 4 houses, including the one I was now living in. I'd been working construction up in Flagstaff for the past 10 years, but inheriting these properties gave me a chance to finally start my own business. The plan was simple: fix up the houses, find good tenants, and build a real estate empire one property at a time. The house on Maple Street was my first success story. It was a cute 3-bedroom place with a nice yard, and I'd found a tenant who seemed perfect on paper. She paid her rent early every month, never complained about anything, and kept the place clean. Her name was Karen Martinez, and according to her rental application, she worked part-time and had excellent references. What the rental application didn't mention was that Karen Martinez was also the self-appointed queen of the Sunset Gardens Homeowners Association. The trouble started the day I decided to install a new gate on my own property. Nothing fancy, just a simple black metal gate to match the existing fence around my yard. I'd gotten all the proper permits, followed every city regulation, and even checked the HOA guidelines to make sure I wasn't breaking any rules. I was just finishing up the installation when I heard the click-clack of high heels on concrete. I turned around to see a woman in her mid-40s marching toward me like she was leading an army into battle. Karen Martinez looked exactly like what you'd picture when someone says, "angry HOA president." Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, her clothes looked like she'd ironed them twice, and she had that special kind of fury that comes from someone who thinks they're saving the world by enforcing mailbox color regulations. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm Karen Martinez, president of the Sunset Gardens HOA, and I need to inspect this unauthorized structure you've installed." She pointed at my perfectly legal gate like it was some kind of nuclear weapon. I looked at her, then at my gate, then back at her. "Ma'am, this is my property and the gate is completely up to code. I have all the permits if you'd like to see them." That's when Karen made her first big mistake. Instead of being reasonable or asking politely to see the documentation, she decided to escalate. "I don't care about your so-called permits," she snapped, pulling out her phone to take pictures. "HOA rules supersede city regulations, and this gate violates our community standards. You need to remove it immediately, or I'll be forced to take action." The way she said "take action" made it sound like she was threatening to call in an airstrike. I couldn't help but smile a little, which only seemed to make her angrier. "Look, Ms. Martinez, I understand you take your HOA duties seriously, but this gate stays. It's legal, it's necessary, and frankly, it's none of your business." What happened next was like watching a 2-year-old have a meltdown in the grocery store, except this 2-year-old was a grown woman with the power to make my life miserable. Karen's face turned bright red, her hands started shaking, and she began pointing her finger at me like she was casting some kind of spell. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she screamed. "I will make your life a living hell until you comply with community standards. This neighborhood has rules and I enforce them." Then, in a move that would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic, she tried to push past me to get through the gate. When I calmly stepped in front of her and politely asked her to leave my property, I made the decision that would change everything. I shut the gate right in her face. The solid click of the latch echoed through the afternoon like a gunshot. For a moment, everything went completely silent. Karen stood there staring at the closed gate with her mouth hanging open, apparently unable to process that someone had actually said no to her. Then the real screaming started. "Open this gate right now," she shrieked, grabbing the metal bars and shaking them like she was trying to escape from prison. "I am the HOA president. I have every right to inspect this property." She started kicking the gate, banging on it with her fists, and generally making such a scene that neighbors began appearing at their windows to see what was happening. As I watched Karen lose her mind on the other side of my gate, I felt something crinkle in my pocket. I pulled out the rental agreement I'd picked up from my property manager that morning. The house on Maple Street, the one I'd bought 6 weeks ago, the one with the quiet tenant who always paid her rent on time. I looked at the address, 1247 Maple Street. Then I looked at Karen, still screaming and carrying on, and a slow smile spread across my face. According to the lease agreement in my hand, Karen Martinez of 1247 Maple Street wasn't just my neighborhood's HOA president. She was my tenant. The woman who was threatening to make my life hell was literally paying my mortgage every month. This was going to be interesting. The next morning, I woke up to what looked like a craft store had exploded on my front gate. Bright orange violation notices were taped everywhere, on the gate itself, on the fence posts, even on my mailbox. Each one screamed, "Illegal fence installation," in bold red letters, followed by a demand for a $500 fine. But here's the thing that made me laugh out loud. The notices were full of spelling errors. Violation, instead of violation. Community, instead of community. And my personal favorite, immediate, instead of immediate. Karen was so angry she couldn't even spell correctly. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of every single notice, focusing especially on the mistakes. If Karen wanted to play games, I was more than happy to play along. Before I could even finish my coffee, my neighbor Doug came walking over from the house next door. Doug was in his 50s, retired from the phone company, and had the kind of dry sense of humor that comes from dealing with difficult people for 30 years. "Welcome to Karen's hit list, buddy," he said, shaking his head as he looked at the violation notices covering my gate. "She did the same thing to me last year when I painted my mailbox the wrong shade of blue. Apparently, it violated the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood." He made air quotes when he said it, and I could tell this wasn't his first rodeo with HOA drama. "How many people has she done this to?" I asked, genuinely curious about the scope of Karen's reign of terror. Doug laughed and gestured down the street. "Just about everyone on this block has had a run-in with her. Mailboxes, paint colors, you name it. Pretty much anyone who's moved in or changed anything about their property in the last year has gotten the Karen treatment." He paused and looked at the violation notices again. "But I got to say, I've never seen her this worked up. You must have really gotten under her skin." That's when I told him about shutting the gate in Karen's face. Doug burst out laughing so hard he started coughing. "Nobody's ever shut her down like that," he chuckled. "You're officially a legend now." That gave me an idea. Instead of just throwing away the violation notices like most people probably did, I decided to have a little fun with them. I went inside, scanned every single notice into my computer, and printed out 10 copies of each one. Then I went outside and taped them all over my fence, adding a handwritten sign that read, "HOA Art Project, spelling errors included." By the time I was finished, my entire fence line looked like a shrine to Karen's incompetence. The reaction from the neighborhood was immediate and hilarious. People started walking by just to read the notices and laugh at the mistakes. Mrs. Patterson from across the street brought her grandkids over to use it as a spelling lesson. "Now children," she said in her teacher voice, "this is why we always proofread our work." Even the mail carrier stopped to take pictures. Within an hour, Karen's violation notices had become the neighborhood joke, and I hadn't even tried to make that happen. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting people see the truth. Karen, of course, did not appreciate becoming a laughingstock. Around lunchtime, I got a call from Doug telling me that Karen had called an emergency HOA meeting for that evening. "She's got Rick Palmer and Mrs. Henderson lined up to vote on your fine," he said. "You might want to show up and defend yourself." I thanked Doug for the heads up and spent the afternoon researching HOA rules and regulations. If Karen wanted to play by the book, I was going to make sure I knew that book better than she did. The meeting was held in Karen's living room, which should have been my first clue that this wasn't exactly an official proceeding. When I knocked on the door at 7 p.m. sharp, Karen answered looking like she'd been preparing for battle. Her hair was pulled back even tighter than usual, she was wearing what I assumed was her most professional outfit, and she had a stack of papers thick enough to choke a horse. "Mr. Thompson," she said coldly, "I wasn't expecting you to attend." "Wouldn't miss it," I replied with a smile. "I hear there's some business to discuss." The meeting consisted of Karen, her sidekick Rick Palmer, and an elderly woman I didn't recognize sitting around Karen's coffee table. Rick was exactly what you'd expect from someone who would volunteer to be Karen's enforcer, mid-40s, thinning hair, and the kind of eager-to-please attitude that screamed hall monitor in high school. Karen called the meeting to order with all the ceremony of a Supreme Court session and immediately launched into a speech about maintaining community standards and dealing with problem residents. Then she called for a vote to uphold the $500 fine for my illegal fence installation. That's when I stood up and pulled out my own stack of papers. Before you vote, I said calmly, I think you should know that according to the HOA bylaws, you need at least 60% of the board present to vote on financial matters. You currently have 3 people out of 12 total board members, which is 25%. I laid copies of the bylaws on the coffee table and pointed to the relevant section. Also, according to city records, my gate has all proper permits and meets every safety requirement. Here's the documentation if you'd like to review it. The look on Karen's face was priceless. She stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language, then looked at Rick and Mrs. Henderson for support. Rick just shrugged, and Mrs. Henderson actually seemed impressed that I'd done my homework. Those rules don't apply to emergency situations, Karen finally sputtered, but even she didn't sound convinced. Emergency situations require an immediate threat to health and safety, I replied. A properly permitted gate hardly qualifies. That's when Karen made her second big mistake of the day. Instead of backing down gracefully, she doubled down on stupid. I don't care what your papers say, she snapped, standing up so fast she knocked over her coffee cup. I am the president of this HOA and what I say goes. You will pay that fine, and you will remove that gate, or I will make your life miserable. The words hung in the air like a threat. And I realized that this was about more than HOA rules or community standards. This was about power, and Karen couldn't handle the fact that someone had challenged her authority. Well, Karen, I said, standing up and gathering my papers, I guess we'll see about that. As I walked out of her house, I could hear her already making plans for her next move. This was far from over. Karen didn't waste any time making good on her threat to escalate things. The very next morning, I was having my coffee when I heard the rumble of a truck pulling up outside. Through my front window, I watched a city code enforcement officer climb out of his white pickup and start walking toward my gate with a clipboard in hand. I knew immediately that Karen had called in the big guns, probably spending half the night on the phone claiming my perfectly legal gate was some kind of public safety hazard. I went outside to meet the officer, a middle-aged guy named Tom Rodriguez who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else than dealing with neighborhood drama on a Tuesday morning. Morning, sir, he said politely. I'm here about a complaint regarding an unauthorized structure. Mind if I take a look at your gate? I handed him my folder of permits and documentation without being asked. Everything's there. Building permit, HOA notification, city inspection certificate. The gate was professionally installed and meets all requirements. Tom spent about 10 minutes examining the gate, checking measurements, and reviewing my paperwork while Karen watched from her front window like a hawk. Well, sir, Tom finally said, closing his clipboard with a definitive snap, I can't find any violations here. This gate is completely legal and properly installed. Whoever called this in was wasting my time and yours. That's when Karen came marching across the street like a woman on a mission. Still in her bathrobe and slippers, but too angry to care about appearances. Officer, that gate is blocking emergency access to the property, she declared, pointing dramatically at my gate. It's a safety hazard and needs to be removed immediately. Tom looked at Karen, then at the gate, then back at Karen with the kind of patience that comes from dealing with difficult people all day. Ma'am, this gate has a standard emergency access override and meets all fire department requirements, Tom explained slowly, like he was talking to a child. The city approved this installation specifically because it follows all safety protocols. Karen's face turned red and she started gesturing wildly. But the HOA rules clearly state that no structures can be installed without board approval, and we never approved this gate. Tom sighed and rubbed his forehead. Ma'am, city regulations supersede HOA rules when it comes to safety and building codes. This gate stays. The way he said it made it clear the conversation was over. But Karen wasn't done making a fool of herself. As Tom was walking back to his truck, she started following him, arguing about HOA authority and community standards and how this gate was going to ruin the neighborhood. Tom finally stopped, turned around, and said in the most diplomatic way possible, Ma'am, I suggest you review your HOA guidelines before filing any more complaints. Have a good day. Then he drove away, leaving Karen standing in the middle of the street looking like someone had just told her Santa Claus wasn't real. I thought that would be the end of it, but Karen was just getting started. That afternoon, I decided to celebrate my legal victory by throwing an impromptu barbecue in my backyard. I invited Doug and a few other neighbors, set up my grill, and made a big sign that read, gate-approved celebration, just to add a little humor to the situation. We were having a great time grilling burgers and sharing Karen horror stories when I heard the unmistakable sound of car doors slamming in my driveway. 2 police officers were walking toward my backyard with Karen trailing behind them like a prosecutor presenting her case. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," said the older officer, a professional-looking man with gray hair and tired eyes. "I'm Officer Martinez and this is Officer Wilson. We got a call about suspicious activity and possible harassment of residents." I looked at the barbecue, then at my neighbors peacefully eating hamburgers, then back at the officers. "Officers, I'm Nathan Thompson and this is my property. We're having a neighborhood barbecue. I'm not sure what suspicious activity you're referring to." Karen stepped forward like she was presenting evidence at a trial. "Officer, this man has been harassing me and violating community standards. He's installed an illegal structure and is now intimidating residents with this gathering." Officer Martinez looked around at the backyard barbecue, taking in the cheerful atmosphere and the neighbors clearly having a good time. Then he looked at Karen and asked, "Ma'am, can you explain how a backyard barbecue constitutes harassment?" While Karen launched into a rambling explanation about HOA violations and community disruption, Doug stood up from his lawn chair and walked over to the officers. "Officers, I'm Doug Brower and I live next door. This lady has been terrorizing the neighborhood for months. She's called in false complaints on half the families on this street. This is the first time anyone stood up to her." That's when something clicked in my mind. During the conversation with Officer Martinez, I mentioned that I owned rental property on the street and was just trying to maintain my investments. "Which property do you own?" the officer asked casually. I pointed down the street toward Karen's house. 1247 Maple Street, the blue house with the white trim. Officer Martinez followed my gaze, then looked at Karen, then back at me. His eyebrows went up slightly and I could see the wheels turning in his head. "That's interesting," he said slowly. "Ma'am, is that your address?" Karen nodded, clearly not understanding the significance. "Yes, that's where I live." "Why?" Officer Martinez exchanged a look with his partner that spoke volumes. "Let me get this straight," he said to Karen. "You're calling in complaints about a man who owns the house you're renting?" The color drained from Karen's face as the implications hit her. What? That's impossible. My landlord is some old man named Henderson." "Ma'am," I said quietly, "Mr. Henderson sold the house to me 6 weeks ago. I'm your new landlord." The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop. Karen stared at me like I'd just spoken in ancient Greek, while the officers tried not to smile at the absurdity of the situation. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said in the tone of someone who had just solved a puzzle, "I strongly suggest you reconsider filing any more complaints about Mr. Thompson. False reports are a serious matter, and this situation seems to be complicated." Karen opened and closed her mouth several times like a fish out of water, but no sounds came out. Officer Wilson, who had been quietly taking notes throughout the whole interaction, looked up and said, "Sir, have you had any other issues with harassment from your tenant?" I thought about the violation notices, the screaming at my gate, and the threats to make my life miserable. "A few minor incidents," I said diplomatically. "Nothing I can't handle." As the officers were leaving, Officer Martinez handed me his card and said quietly, "If you have any more problems, give us a call. And document everything just in case." Then they drove away, leaving Karen standing in my driveway looking like someone had just pulled the rug out from under her feet. The barbecue guests had watched the whole thing unfold with the fascination of people watching a particularly dramatic soap opera episode. Doug raised his beer and said, "Well, that was better entertainment than cable TV." But I could see in Karen's eyes that this was far from over. If anything, learning that I was her landlord had just raised the stakes in whatever game she thought she was playing. After the police visit, I realized that Karen wasn't going to give up easily. If anything, learning that I was her landlord seemed to make her more determined to prove that she could still control the situation. That evening, while I was cleaning up from the barbecue, I made a decision that would prove crucial in the days to come. I was going to document everything, every interaction, every violation notice, every act of petty revenge that Karen could dish out. If this was going to be a war of attrition, I wanted to make sure I had all the ammunition I needed. The first thing I did was install a basic security camera system around my property. Nothing too fancy, just a few weatherproof cameras that would record anyone approaching my gate or front door. I made sure to position them so they only captured my property and the public street, staying well within legal boundaries. I also started keeping a detailed log of every interaction with Karen, including dates, times, and witnesses when possible. Doug had offered to be my unofficial lookout, keeping an eye on things when I wasn't home, and I was grateful for the support. I didn't have to wait long for Karen's next move. Over the next few days, petty sabotage became routine. I'd wake up to find my trash cans knocked over, my garden hose unwound across the yard, or mysterious substances smeared on my gate. Each incident was minor by itself, but the pattern was clear. Karen was trying to make my life miserable through a campaign of petty vandalism and intimidation. What she didn't realize was that my cameras were capturing everything, creating a detailed record of her behavior that would prove invaluable later. The escalation continued when Karen started recruiting Rick Palmer to help with her campaign. I caught them on camera one night around 2 a.m., with Rick acting as lookout while Karen stuffed toilet paper in my mailbox and smeared something unpleasant on my front gate. The footage was crystal clear, showing both of their faces and their license plate numbers. But what struck me most wasn't the vandalism itself. It was how desperate Karen looked. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes were wrinkled, and she moved with the frantic energy of someone who was coming apart at the seams. During the day, Karen's behavior became increasingly erratic in public. She started going door to door in the neighborhood, trying to rally support for her campaign against me. She printed up flyers calling me a threat to community values, and left them on car windshields. But the more extreme her behavior became, the more the neighborhood turned against her. People who had been quietly tolerating her harassment for months finally found their voices. Mrs. Patterson called Karen's claims nonsense, and invited me to her granddaughter's birthday party as a quiet show of solidarity. The Martinez family put up a sign in their front yard that read, "Welcome good neighbors," which everyone understood was directed at me and against Karen's campaign. Even Rick Palmer started backing away from Karen's crusade. His wife had apparently told him to stay away from the drama, and he didn't want to risk getting arrested for vandalism or harassment. The breaking point came when Karen discovered my security cameras. I was inside reviewing some property investment documents when I heard shouting outside. Through my window, I could see Karen standing in front of my gate, pointing up at one of the cameras and screaming about illegal surveillance and invasion of privacy. She had Rick with her, but he looked increasingly uncomfortable with the whole situation, like a sidekick who was starting to question the villain's master plan. "Those cameras are illegal." Karen was yelling loud enough for the whole street to hear. "You can't spy on people without their permission. I'm calling the police right now." I went outside to explain that the cameras only recorded my own property and the public street, which was perfectly legal. But Karen was beyond reasoning. She grabbed a rake from my yard and started trying to knock down the cameras, screaming about privacy rights and harassment. That's when I realized Karen had crossed a line from annoying to potentially dangerous. Rick Palmer finally found his backbone and tried to calm Karen down, but she turned on him like a rabid dog. "Don't you dare side with him," she snarled. "This is about defending our community against outsiders who don't respect our values." Rick took a step back, clearly intimidated by the fury in Karen's voice. But I could see doubt creeping into his eyes. He was starting to realize that he'd hitched his wagon to someone who was completely out of control. That night, as I reviewed the security footage of Karen's latest meltdown, I made another decision. It was time to start preparing for the endgame. I pulled out the rental agreement for 1247 Maple Street and read through every line, familiarizing myself with the terms and conditions. Karen had been a model tenant up until now, rent paid on time, no complaints from neighbors, no property damage. But harassment of the landlord and disturbing the peace weren't exactly covered in the standard lease agreement. I had options, but I wanted to give Karen one more chance to come to her senses before I played my final card. The next few days brought an eerie calm to the neighborhood, like the silence before a thunderstorm. Karen seemed to be regrouping, spending most of her time inside her house with the curtains drawn. But the calm didn't last long. Karen's next escalation came in the form of a full-scale propaganda campaign. She printed up dramatic flyers calling me a threat to the community, and went door to door hoping to turn neighbors against me. The flyers were full of wild accusations and outright lies, but they were professionally printed and looked official enough to fool someone who didn't know the real story. What Karen didn't count on was how much the community dynamics had changed since my arrival. Instead of intimidating people into silence, her campaign actually backfired. Neighbors who had been quietly suffering under her reign of terror for months finally found their voices. The breaking point came when Karen discovered that her door-to-door campaign wasn't working. Instead of backing down, she decided to take her harassment to the next level by targeting my security cameras directly. I was working in my home office when I heard glass breaking outside, followed by Karen's voice screaming something about illegal surveillance and taking back the neighborhood. I looked out my window to see her standing in my front yard with a baseball bat, having just smashed one of my camera housings. What happened next was like watching someone have a complete mental breakdown in slow motion. Karen started swinging the bat at everything she could reach, my mailbox, my fence, even the flowers in my front garden. All the while, she was screaming a stream of consciousness rant about property values and community standards and how I was ruining everything she'd worked so hard to build. The remaining security cameras captured every moment of her rampage, creating irrefutable evidence of vandalism and destruction of property. The noise brought neighbors out of their houses to see what was happening. And what they witnessed was shocking even by Karen's standards. Her hair was wild and unwashed. Her clothes were stained and wrinkled, and she moved with the frantic energy of someone who had completely lost touch with reality. "He's destroying our community," she screamed at anyone who would listen. "He doesn't belong here. He doesn't understand our values." But the neighbors weren't buying it anymore. They could see who was really destroying the community, and it wasn't me. Mrs. Peterson from down the street started recording Karen's meltdown on her phone, which made Karen even more furious. "Stop recording me," she shrieked, pointing the baseball bat in Mrs. Peterson's direction. "This is harassment. This is invasion of privacy." But Mrs. Peterson kept recording and other neighbors pulled out their phones too. Within minutes, Karen's breakdown was being documented from multiple angles by multiple witnesses, creating a comprehensive record of her completely unhinged behavior. That's when Karen made the mistake that would ultimately seal her fate. In her rage and desperation, she called 911 to report that I was threatening residents with illegal surveillance and inciting violence against community leaders. When the police arrived, they found Karen still holding the baseball bat, surrounded by the debris of my destroyed property, while a crowd of neighbors looked on in shock. The contrast between her wild claims and the obvious reality of the situation was stark. Officer Martinez, the same policeman who had responded to Karen's previous complaint, took one look at the scene and immediately understood what had happened. "Ma'am, I need you to put down the bat and step away from the property," he said in the calm, authoritative voice of someone who had dealt with this type of situation before. Karen complied but continued her frantic explanation about community defense and property values and how I was the real threat to neighborhood safety. While Officer Wilson took statements from the neighbors who had witnessed Karen's rampage, Officer Martinez examined the damage to my property and reviewed the security footage that had captured the entire incident. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Karen had committed multiple acts of vandalism while trespassing on my property, all while claiming to be defending the community from my alleged crimes. "Sir," Officer Martinez said to me quietly, "do you want to press charges for vandalism and destruction of property?" I looked at Karen, who was finally beginning to realize the magnitude of what she had done. The fight had gone out of her, and she looked smaller somehow, like a deflated balloon. Her neighbors were staring at her with a mixture of shock and disappointment, and I could see the exact moment when she understood that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. "Officer," I said carefully, "I think this situation needs to be resolved properly. There are some things that need to be cleared up before anyone makes any decisions about pressing charges." I pulled out the rental agreement from my pocket and handed it to Officer Martinez. "Officer, I need you to understand something. Karen Martinez isn't just a problem neighbor. She's my tenant. Every act of harassment, every violation notice, every threat she's made has been directed at her own landlord." Officer Martinez looked at the rental agreement, then at Karen, then back at me. His eyebrows went up as the full implications of the situation hit him. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "is this correct? Are you renting property from Mr. Thompson?" Karen nodded slowly, finally understanding that her entire campaign against me had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of our relationship. "As her landlord," I continued, "I have the legal right to evict her for harassment and property damage. As a member of this community, I have the right to press charges for vandalism and intimidation." I looked around at the neighbors who had been watching the whole drama unfold. "However, I'm willing to offer Karen a choice. She can resign from the HOA presidency, make arrangements to move out within 60 days, and we can all move forward without involving the courts. Or we can handle this through the legal system, which won't be pleasant for anyone involved." Karen looked at the destruction she had caused, then at the neighbors who had once respected her authority, then at the police officers who were waiting for her decision. I resign," she whispered. "I'll move out. I just want it to matter somewhere. I just wanted to have some control over something." The aftermath was swift and decisive. Karen resigned from the HOA presidency that very night, handing over her nameplate and keys to Doug, who had been unanimously elected as interim president. True to her word, Karen began making arrangements to move out immediately. She found a small apartment across town and spent the next few weeks quietly packing up her belongings. Without Karen's reign of terror, the neighborhood came alive again. Children played in their yards without fear of noise complaints. Families hosted barbecues without worrying about violation notices. People painted their mailboxes whatever color they wanted. The house on Maple Street found a new tenant quickly, a young family with 2 small children who were thrilled to be living in such a friendly and welcoming neighborhood. 2 months after Karen moved out, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. She had written a heartfelt apology, enclosed a small check to cover the damage she'd caused, and admitted she was getting counseling to deal with her need for control. "I know this doesn't undo the harm I caused," she wrote, "but I wanted you to know that I understand now how badly I handled my pain and anger. You showed me more mercy than I deserved, and I'm grateful for the chance to start over somewhere else." It was a mature and thoughtful letter that showed genuine remorse and self-reflection. Looking back on the whole experience, I realized that sometimes the most difficult neighbors are really just people who are struggling with problems they don't know how to handle. Karen's need for control and authority came from feeling powerless in other areas of her life. Her harassment and intimidation were wrong and inexcusable, but understanding the root causes helped me respond with firmness rather than cruelty. The gate that started the whole conflict still stands in my front yard, now weathered and completely unremarkable. Neighbors walk past it every day without giving it a second thought, which is exactly how it should be. Sometimes I stand at that gate and remember the day Karen first screamed at me about community standards and HOA regulations. It seems like a lifetime ago from a different neighborhood entirely. Now kids ride bikes past the gate, and the biggest drama is whether the Halloween decorations are too scary for the little ones. If you've ever dealt with a neighborhood bully or an HOA situation that got out of hand, remember that documentation is your best friend, and patience is your greatest weapon. Sometimes the person causing the most trouble is fighting battles you know nothing about. But that doesn't mean you have to accept abuse or harassment. Stand your ground, follow the rules, and eventually the truth will come out. And if you're lucky like I was, you might even help someone find a better path forward while protecting your community in the process. The best victories are the ones where everybody learns something, and life gets better for everyone involved.